Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition, our 254th, we've got Matt Clemente, who's going to be giving his ColdFusion Summit presentation called Get CFML, Guide to Writing API Wrappers. And again, for anybody listening, this is being recorded on Thursday, October 31st, 2019 at noon U.S. Eastern. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop the screen share, and Matt, you can take it away.
All right, thank you. And we'll get started here, and you let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, looks good. Yeah.
All right, because I only have one screen, I won't be able to see your chats for the most part while I'm doing this, so I think it makes the most sense. We'll review any questions at the end, assuming that we have time. And with that, let's get... Sorry, what was that, Charlie? Okay, let's open. All right. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, maybe you don't know this, but the slide will tell you, I believe that APIs are awesome. And this is my first time presenting in an online meetup, so I just want to confirm here that if someone could, I can actually see the chat now. If someone could let me know. Slides are showing, everything's good?
Yep.
All right.
All's well.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Minimize that. APIs are awesome, which is fantastic. I'm not ashamed to say that I've referred to them as superpowered magic Legos, in that they're these magical little blocks that we can put into our application, and they give us the ability to do things that we wouldn't be able to do on our own. They give us superpowers, and we can stack them on top of each other and use them with our application. So I love using APIs. And it's a great time to love APIs, given that it seems that every single thing has an API at this point. The growth of APIs is absolutely through the roof. This may be a false memory, but I do believe that there was an episode of Oprah where she gave everyone an API. I might not be remembering that right, but it does seem that every single thing has an API, from geocoding addresses and IP addresses to handling online payment processing, cloud storage validation. The list goes on and on and on, and it's really exciting. I've included here a link at the bottom to Todd Moto's list of public APIs, which, if you're interested at all in the types of APIs that are available publicly, it's a great place to start. If you scroll down, it's exceedingly long. You know, there's APIs for cats and dogs, obviously, but there's a goat API. Animals, art, books, design, the list goes on and on. You know, I've been scrolling for a while here. We're still only in the C's: cryptocurrency, data validation. So certainly, if you're interested in APIs, take a look at that link and go through those. That's where I found some fascinating ones. For example, Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec has an API. And if you work with DigitalOcean, they have an API that enables you to create virtual machines and destroy them, create firewalls. It's really, there's a tremendous amount of power in these APIs, which is why we want to use them. But as ColdFusion developers, we know that, unfortunately, ColdFusion typically isn't one of the 1, 2, or 3 APIs, wrappers that are provided by the API provider. Typically, API providers will give you a couple client libraries, and ColdFusion's not one of them, which means it's an opportunity for us to write API wrappers. Now, I've said that word a number of times already, so let's just go over what we're talking about here. There's a number of different terms that are used for the same thing. So they may be called API libraries, client helpers, some combination of all these terms, you know, PayPal, REST helper, client, SDKs. But it's all the same thing. In ColdFusion, we're talking about a component that has functions which map one-to-one with the endpoint of an API. And by doing that, they encapsulate, they wrap the functionality of the API, and then you can use that component and the API's functionality throughout your application. The reason that we want to do this is because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to have to figure out how to geocode a zip code or an IP address because someone's already done that and we can use the API. We don't need to figure out payment processing because someone who's super smart figured out payment processing. And whether it's Stripe or Braintree or PayPal, there's an API for that. There was a quote that I read online a while back, maybe the first time I was working on this presentation, that said, don't reinvent the wheel. The internet is full of wheels and most of them have APIs. So this idea of not reinventing the wheel, it's one of the reasons we use APIs, and it's going to be a theme that comes up throughout this presentation. All right. You found an API, you have an API, internal or public, that you want to write a wrapper for. How do we get started with that? I'm of the opinion that the first step when you're writing an API wrapper is actually don't write an API wrapper. See if there's one out there already. The first place that I go to look for them is ForgeBox. For those of you who aren't familiar with ForgeBox, it's a repository of ColdFusion projects, various different types of them, but one of the types are API wrappers. If you are familiar with it or only loosely familiar, I think there's a little bit of a misconception that ForgeBox is only for ColdBox, things that use the ColdBox framework, and I can tell you that that's not true. I'm not a ColdBox user, and I put all of the API wrappers that I write on ForgeBox. So you can take a look there. You can search for APIs, and if you scroll down, you'll see there's a large number of APIs, a bunch, or some that I put up here recently, but the Marvel API, if you want to use Pingdom, there's already an API for that. Matt Gifford wrote it, and it's up there on ForgeBox, so you can take a look at that project. Similarly, if you search on GitHub, you can find ColdFusion projects that have API wrappers. Just a example for the demo, but there's 2 ColdFusion wrappers for the Star Wars API. So if you wanted to work with that, you don't need to write that. It's already been written. And then along with that, there's the CFML Slack channel. A plug for that as well, cfml.slack.com. If you haven't joined that, I encourage you to. There's a lot of ColdFusion developers on there asking questions, giving answers. And if you're looking for an API wrapper, that might be a place where you could ask and someone could point you in the right direction. Adobe has their ColdFusion portal and their search engines. Not to belabor a point, but there's a lot of places that you can look where there are already ColdFusion wrappers for APIs. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. The projects might already be out there. That is one of the ways that I got here. I like to tell the story. I don't know if anyone remembers payment processing online about 20 years ago, but the way I describe it was that it was the Wild West. It was kind of no rules, anything goes, or there were rules, but they were ignored. So I worked at a company that was handling credit card information, and they were emailing it to a bookkeeper who was setting up QuickBooks subscriptions in her own account, and it was a giant mess. So eventually we convinced management to switch to Stripe. And I found John Berquest's Stripe CFML wrapper, which made it really easy to use Stripe's API. And we were able to, upgrade our application, make it more secure, much easier to work with. And honestly, it was a delight working with his wrapper. I looked a bit at the code underneath. I was impressed with how well organized it was, how elegant the code was. And that stuck with me. So a couple years later, I'm at a different company, and we're switching our email service from Amazon's SES to Mailgun. And there's not a ColdFusion wrapper for the latest version of Mailgun's API, so I decide I'm going to try my hand at writing one. And I took John's Stripe wrapper, and I took out the Stripe specific pieces, and I put in Mailgun specific pieces, and it worked. And this pattern continued. We switched from Mailgun to SendGrid, and I reworked that API wrapper to work with SendGrid's API. And then at that point, you could say that I got a little bit carried away and just started writing API wrappers for every API that I came in contact with. Along the way, one of the things that I learned was, yes, every API is different. But when you're writing API wrappers, they're really all the same. The reason for this is REST and HTTP. HTTP being the protocol and REST being that architectural style of requests and responses. 99% of the APIs that we're working with are RESTful, or if they're not officially RESTful, they're REST-ish. They have this established pattern of request and response. So writing a wrapper becomes much simpler because there's a pattern and you just need to follow that pattern. Adam Tuttle is a developer. He wrote Taffy, which is a ColdFusion REST framework. He described REST as CRUD over HTTP, so create, retrieve, update, delete. And that's most of what our wrappers need to deal with. They need to deal with those types of requests. And then there's some exceptions. There's some things that don't fall within that simple structure, create, retrieve, update, delete. But that's the bulk of what our wrappers are dealing with. A familiarity with REST and even with the fundamentals of HTTP is a great foundation to have if you're going to be writing API wrappers. I do recommend, Adam's book is called Rest Assured. I have a link down there in the bottom to it. As the title says, it's very pragmatic, it's very practical, it's also very accessible. He's a developer and he's writing for developers. I found it very helpful, so I definitely recommend it as a resource if you want a primer on REST that's actually helpful. If you'll bear with me for a minute, I'm going to do a quick primer review, a foundation on HTTP, because these are the elements that the wrappers that we build need to account for. In an HTTP request, our wrapper needs to account for 6 elements. It needs to account for the method, the host, path, params, the headers, and the body. The method that our wrapper is going to deal with, there's only going to be 5 of them. In 99% of the cases, there's going to be get, post, put, patch, and delete. So our wrapper, it's pretty straightforward that we have these 5 elements that the wrapper is going to need to deal with for any particular request. When you're writing a wrapper, the host that you're interacting with is a constant. Any call to the Stripe API, it's going to be made to api.stripe.com. That's not going to change, so it can be set once in your wrapper, usually in the init, and then it's a constant throughout all the requests that get made. If you remember from our definition of an API wrapper, the endpoints of the API are mapped one-to-one to the functions within your wrapper. Those endpoints, the API's endpoints, are the URL paths. And then a lot of the work writing the wrappers actually ends up being when you have to deal with params, putting together URL params, and the body, which is usually, but not always, assembling JSON. Finally, you have the headers, which are where content type negotiation takes place. I'm sending JSON, I'm expecting JSON, I'm sending form URL encoded data. And the headers are also where authentication takes place. So, where you actually get permission to use the API. Our API wrappers need to account for these 6 elements in a request. And then the response is even simpler. There's the status code and the status text. So 200, okay, everything's great. 400, there's a problem, we need to deal with it. And I like to share, it's real. My favorite status code and status text are in the RFC spec, status code 418, and the status text is I'm a teapot. And while I've never seen that actually used, it's 100% real. So it's a great developer bit of trivia to know. APIs will typically return headers. Sometimes they're not terribly important, but a lot of APIs will return useful information to developers in the headers that they return, such as account or rate limiting information. And then finally, if you've requested data, hopefully you're getting that data back. Hopefully it's JSON, but maybe it's XML or some other format. And that's the response. So request and response, those are the elements that our API wrapper needs to account for. With that, HTTP 101 out of the way, we're going to dive in to the CAT API. The CAT API is obviously good for nothing except for demos. And the story I like to tell about this one is when my 4- and 6-year-old daughter encountered me working on this presentation and working on a wrapper for the CAT API, they thought I had the coolest job in the world as I refreshed CAT GIF after CAT GIF. So I won Dad of the Morning due to the CAT API. So it's not good for nothing. It has at least 2 uses. If we were going to deal with the CAT API manually, it might look something like this. We'd assemble the query params that we needed for our request. Then we'd make a CF HTTP request. In it, we'd set the method. So this is going to be a GET request. We'd put together the URL to that specific path. So this one's going to v1 images search. Those query params that we assembled, we'd include them. And then we'd make sure that we had our headers there included as well. So the content type, application JSON, the API key, because the CAT API requires an API key, and our user agent. When the response came back, we would deserialize it, and then we'd have a CAT GIF. This works. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not a superpowered magic Lego. It's not something that you can put within your application and reuse and be excited about using. So we'll compare this approach with the API wrapper approach. And just on its face, it's much more simple and elegant. You create your wrapper, you ask it for a random cat GIF, and then you can output the image of the cat right there. It's a much more preferable approach. It makes interacting with the API easier and reusing it throughout your application much easier. Just another reason why we would want to write these wrappers instead of just making CF HTTP requests. Now, you have an API, you want to write a wrapper. I would say don't go out there and write the API wrapper from scratch, unless you really want to. More power to you if you really want to. But the truth is that you don't have to. You don't need to write it from scratch. There's some tools out there that you can use that make writing ColdFusion API wrappers easier. The first one I'm going to mention is called Hyper. It's a tool that was built by Eric Peterson. Eric works for Ortus Solutions. That's the company behind the ColdBox framework. It's the company behind the command box tool. And Eric wrote this, I've talked to him about it, because he was in a similar position that I was, where he had written a number of API wrappers and found that he was doing the same thing over and over again. So Hyper was his solution to not having to deal with that boilerplate code over and over and over again. It has a fluent syntax for building your HTTP requests, and it just makes it much easier to deal with APIs. So that's one tool. I should note that it is not ColdBox specific, and you can find Eric on the CFML Slack channel, ask him questions about it. It's documented. That's one tool that you can use. And I meant to include, maybe I can find that after the fact. There's a video online of one of the other Ortus developers, Michael Bourne, using Hyper, and he filmed himself on Twitch, so it was real time as he wrote an API wrapper using Hyper. So if you're interested at all in that, that might be something that you want to track down. I could help find that for you. The other tool, which we'll be using a bit more today, is a tool that I wrote. It's called API Wrapper Template, and it's a command box tool that scaffolds API clients. Basically, when I found myself writing API wrappers like Mailguns and SendGrids, I would have the Mailgun folder, I would copy and I would paste it, and then I would start doing find and replaces to change it over from Mailgun to SendGrid. And this whole copy, paste, find, and replace, it's just not very efficient for writing an API wrapper. So what this tool did was automate that process. So it takes a handful of variables, and then it does all that scaffolding, puts together all that boilerplate code so that it's easier to just start interacting with the API's endpoints. Now, This uses command box. So I'm going to do a little plug for command box here because I gave this talk at CF Summit a month ago about, and there were a number of people in the audience who weren't familiar with command box. Command box is a tool by Ortus Solutions. It runs on Windows, Linux, and Mac. And among other things, it gives you the ability to spin up a ColdFusion server on your local machine right from the command line very easily. Box server start, and then you can have an Adobe 2018 and Adobe 2016 or even 11 or 10 server running right there. Makes it really easy to test and run your code. And as a ColdFusion developer, it's made my life so much easier. So even if you don't get anything out of this session about API wrappers, I really recommend that you check out command box. Just a strong plug for that. No benefit to me, I just think it's a fantastic tool. This API wrapper template tool uses command box. So you don't need to use this tool, it just makes my life easier. So I'm going to show how you'd install it if you had command box, and I'll use it to spin up the wrappers today, because like I said, it makes my life easier. In the command line, so there's nothing in my directory here. I'm going to start up command box because I already have it installed on my machine. Takes a second to spin up. And then I'm going to run that command, install API wrapper template. And that tool is now on my machine. So throughout the session, I'll be able to use that tool when I'm scaffolding my API wrappers. Back here. When we get started with any API, my first recommendation is take 5 minutes and read the API's documentation. In talking with some other developers who write API wrappers a lot, Matt Gifford, John Berquest, that was one of the recommendations that came back. Just take some time and read the docs. Certainly for public APIs, the API providers put a lot of work into providing good documentation. Because if you think about it, an API doesn't really exist unless it's being used, and it's not going to be used unless it's well documented. So they work on their documentation, and it does make your life easier. Some of the things to look for are what type of authentication takes place, do they have testing endpoints, are there any limitations, what's the format of the data. I mentioned that one because I was working on an earlier version of the CAT API, probably 2 years ago now. And I started working on it, started building the wrapper, and it wasn't until far too far along that I realized that earlier version only returned XML, which was frustrating at the time, and I wish I had known that in advance, which is to say I wish I had read the documentation. So always look at that. Another tip, if you're working with a public API, is to review other client libraries. And that might sound counterintuitive, but you can learn a lot from other client libraries. They can give you insights into how the API works. I'm a ColdFusion developer. I'm not a Node developer. I'm not a Python developer, but I can read that other code. I can't write it myself. So I can look at what's going on there. And if I run into a hard point, other client libraries can often provide insights into what's actually going on in the API. So there's certainly a good place to look. And I'll mention a few times throughout this things that you might glean from other client libraries. All right, we have our CAT API wrapper, and we're going to use this scaffolding tool to get started dealing with it. When I'm starting a wrapper, these are the points that I've set up the scaffolding tool to ask for. They ask for the name of the API, unsurprisingly. That name is used to create, the core CFC, that core wrapper component that's going to be used. The endpoint that the requests are going to be made to, because that's going to be a constant, so it'll set that. All the requests are going to go to that endpoint URL. The type of authentication that the API uses, and some elements of the wrapper are included or not based on the type of authentication that's used. I always make sure that I include the API's doc URL, and that's for documentation, but it's also really for me because as you work with an API, you'll find yourself going back to the documentation all the time. So having that saved and in your project is very helpful. If you want to name it, if you want to provide a description, include your name as an author, it asks for those elements. And then finally, there's an option that I have there called package. And what this does, if you set it to true, is it creates a box.json file that is in the root of the project. It's a box.json file. This is what makes it possible to share your wrapper on ForgeBox. All you need to share a project on ForgeBox is the CFC, and then you need a box.json file which describes what that CFC does. And if that sounds confusing or annoying, you certainly don't need to do that. When I'm using my scaffolding wrapper, that defaults to false, but I usually set it to true. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, I have this link down here at the bottom to a blog post where I described my first time putting a package on ForgeBox, and I kind of walked through the process, the points that tripped me up, and how it works. So if you're interested in sharing your wrappers, which I would encourage you to do, this might be helpful if you're going to share them on ForgeBox. All right. I'm going to do this from the command line now, just to show you how the wrapper works. So we're going to write API wrapper, scaffold, and we're going to use its wizard. It's asking for the name of the API, the cat API, the endpoint URL, which I have here. I'll paste that in. The type of authentication, it was API key. Doc URL I have here. A name for it, we'll call it CFCat. Description, some people are dog people. This wrapper is for cat people. Author, that's me, and I will create a box.json. What that tool just did is it spun up all of the boilerplate code that I need for an API wrapper and put it in this directory. So if I say ls, I see now I have a cat API wrapper folder, and I can cd into that and open that up in code to see what it generated. Now this is probably a little bit small, so to describe it better, we'll hop back to the presentation, and we'll take a look at the directory structure that got scaffolded. This is the structure that I use when I'm writing API wrappers. So at the top level, I have this folder, cat API wrapper. I don't put this top level folder in version control. All that I have in it is an index.cfm and a server.json. And now I have to turn off notifications. I didn't realize they were on. Do not disturb. I have an index.cfm and a server.json. That server.json is used by command box in order to spin up a ColdFusion server. So it can say, when you're running something in this directory, I want to start a ColdFusion 2018 server. That index.cfm I use to run my test calls while I'm messing around with the API. So I can make my test requests on that page. The real project itself is within that cfcat folder. It's the actual API client module. Within it, I have a box.json because I said that I want to put this on ForgeBox, but you don't have to have that there. I have a license and a README, the README for documentation. I'm going to say this over and over again, but I really encourage you to document API wrappers if you're building them. Even if you don't intend on sharing them or making them public, document them for your own sake, because as I've found time and time again, I'm not the same developer that I was 6 months ago or a year ago, and I don't remember everything that I do. So when I have documentation I can go back to, it makes it a lot easier to return to older projects. So just document for your own sake. And then finally, we have that cat API.cfc. That's our actual wrapper component. So we're going to jump in there and take a look at actually interacting with the API. When I'm putting my functions within my API wrapper, the way that I like to structure them, this function is going to be mapped to an endpoint. It's going to have a method name. I'll pass in whatever parameters are needed for this method. But then every single method in my API wrappers, I delegate to a root API call method. And what that method does is all of the work that CFHTTP was doing in the manual requests. So that root API call method sets the method, the endpoint, it assembles the query params, puts together any JSON. It handles that CF HTTP work. All of my methods will delegate down to that. So what that means practically, rather than abstractly, is in the cat API, it might look like this. I have a search method. Let's go into that search endpoint. It takes a struct of data because there's a number of parameters that could be passed into here. And to that root API call method, it passes, says I want to do a get request to images/search, and I want you to take this struct of data and assemble it as query params. One of the things that I like about this structure is that the method path params, this structure, the order in which those arguments are laid out, mirrors the documentation style of a lot of public APIs. So a lot of them have, this is the method that you make to this endpoint, and this is the arguments that it can take. So by structuring my functions like that, I find it much easier to work with and to write them. Now you'll see that that method is called search, and it's going to that endpoint images/search. The reason I named that is because I'm modeling it on the API documentation. Search, that endpoint, falls outside of the typical create, retrieve, update, delete pattern. So in terms of determining how I was going to name that function, I used the name of the endpoint. Modeling your method names on the API documentation is a very helpful approach to coming up with your method names. Another approach is looking to official API clients. So if the official API client calls the method search, you can copy that and you don't need to come up with a name for the method on your own. I tend to think a lot about how I name methods. I obsess over it, probably a little too much. So if there are any patterns or approaches that I can take that make it easier for me, I like to find them. So modeling it on the API documentation, looking to official clients are two of those things that I do. And then the other is just I have a pattern for CRUD type requests. If there's a create request, that is to say, if it's a post to the API, generally I'll call that method, the corresponding method, create item, or create resource, create user, create postcard, whatever the request is doing. Reads, if I'm getting an individual item, that is, I'm passing in an identifier and I'm getting a single item back, I'll call it get item. If more than one is coming back, like I'm getting an array in response, I'll call it list items. Update and delete with put and patch and delete follow a similar pattern. And I use this as a shorthand for easily coming up with the names that I'm going to use for my methods. But the bottom line is you don't need to use any of these patterns, but I would say that you want to be consistent with your naming. To use the cat API as an example, there's two types of resources in it. There's cats and then there's breeds. So if I'm dealing with that API and I'm getting all of them back, I'm going to call it list cats and list breeds. I know that when I'm interacting with any resource, list is going to be the shorthand for getting it back. It would be confusing and frustrating if I was working with the API and it was list cats and then something like get all breeds. It just causes mental work and frustration. So the bottom line, have a method, pun intended, to your madness when you're naming your functions within your wrapper, and above all, be consistent with your naming conventions. All right, we're actually gonna work with the API, with the cat API here. So I'm gonna copy this. Right, we're gonna hop in. The cat API actually already exists on ForgeBox because I created it. So what this does, let's hop back in here. It creates the cat API object, then it gets a random GIF, gets the data, and outputs the image in the browser. So let's hop into my cat folder. I'm going to say server start, and this is going to spin up a ColdFusion 2018 server in the project, and it's going to run that code. So all goes well, we'll have a picture of a cat in the browser in a second. And there we go, our cat GIF. You can't work with the cat API without running a few requests to see the various images that come back. All right, enough cats for now. Our image comes back. So we run this code, we get our cat picture. That's lovely. But a thing to note is that that HTTP response, it was more than just that data, the cat picture that was coming back. Headers were returned, the status code was returned, and status text was returned. When you're writing an API wrapper, you want to account for those elements in the response as well. You don't want to just return the file content of your request. You want to return headers, status code, and status text. And in the case of the CAT API, it's not a complicated API, so the headers aren't particularly meaningful, but in more complex APIs, they will be. With regard to the status code, it's helpful for developers using your API. If they see that a 400 request came back, they can handle that response elegantly, as opposed to having to deal with just a broken file content. So HTTP responses are more than just data. Your users are developers, so it's helpful to give them all of that data, the headers, the status code, and the status text. Another tip when you're writing API wrappers is to try to make your own life easier. Put tools in place to make it easier to debug issues with the wrapper. There's two ways that I like to do this. The first is by making that base URL a variable, that is making it possible to change that while I'm working with the wrapper. And you might object, oh, but you said that that URL is a constant. It is a constant, except when you're debugging and you want it to be a constant pointing elsewhere. Basically what I do is there's a number of services out there. I have some of them listed down here. And what they do is provide you with an endpoint that you could put in there. You can put into your wrapper. You make the requests to that endpoint, and they allow you to inspect the requests. So Receptor is one. And what you can do is you can say, create this endpoint for me. And anything that I send now to demo-endpoint.free.bceptor.com will show here, and I would be able to inspect it. So I'll be able to inspect the body, the response, the headers that came in, the headers that were returned. It's a fantastic tool for building APIs, but also for working with your API wrappers. And there's a couple other tools that provide that type of service. The reason that you might want to inspect the body that you're posting or the URL params that you're putting together when you're sending them to an API is that depending on the version of ColdFusion that you're using, sometimes serializing and deserializing JSON, there can be some issues with that. So that being able to analyze your HTTP requests from the perspective of the API provider can help debug strange issues with that. And then even aside from serialization issues, there are very complex APIs out there where you may be nesting multiple structs and arrays, and putting that together in the right order can be difficult. So being able to look at the request that you made and make sure that you structured it correctly is essential in writing an API wrapper. One of the other approaches that I use is I have an include raw option in my wrappers. What this does, rather than just explain it, I will show it to you. If we spin up the CAT API and we set the include raw equal to true, it tracks the params, the body, and the endpoint that the request is being made to, and it shows that to me in the response that comes back from the API. So along with the data that's being returned from this request and the headers and the status code, I have this raw key which shows me the elements of the request that I made. And this makes it easy to make sure that it went to the right path, that the URL params were assembled correctly, that I understand the structure of the body coming back. Just two tips, making your own life easier, finding ways to inspect the requests that your wrapper is making. That makes it a lot easier to write an API wrapper. All right, get a drink of water. All right. When you're writing a wrapper, you obviously need to deal with authentication. Unless there's no authentication, but that's far less common now than it was at one point in time. Basic authentication, basic auth, you'll remember from your HTTP 101 class is a username colon password that's base 64 encoded and passed in an authorization header. I'm using API key authentication here as a kind of catch-all because API providers, they'll give you a key, some unique identifier, and they'll ask for it back. Usually that's in a header, but on occasion it'll be in the body or as a URL param. They handle this in a variety of different ways. And then there's open authorization, OAuth. And OAuth refers to when there's three parties involved. So there's the API provider, there's your wrapper, and then there's a third party. And that third party is granting your API wrapper access to the API. And honestly, that's a bit outside the scope of this project, but that's another element that you have to deal with sometimes. How do we do this in ColdFusion? If we're using basic authentication, if the API requires basic authentication, CFHTTP provides the username and password attributes, and that takes care of it for you. If there is API key authentication, usually you'd pass that using CFHTTP param type header, and you can pass the API key that way. For open authorization, like I said, it's a bit outside the scope of this session, but Matt Gifford has a ColdFusion OAuth project where he's dealt with a number of different providers, Facebook, FreshBooks, GitHub, GitLab. He's knowledgeable in that space. He's done ColdFusion work in that space. So if you're interested in that, that might be a good starting point. As we're talking about API keys, this type of sensitive information, the recommended practice is that that type of config information is kept separate from your code, which is really just a fancy way of saying you shouldn't have to include your credentials in your API wrapper. People using your API wrapper shouldn't have to hard code their credentials into it. That config and the code should be separate. The way that we do that is by using environment variables. So if you're writing a wrapper, it's beneficial for security and just reuse and convenience purposes to enable it to accept environment variables, accept the API key credentials via environment variables. Which sounds complicated, but fortunately in ColdFusion it's not. We can just drop into Java, create the Java Lang system object, and that system object gives us access to environment variables as well as Java system properties. So if there's one that we're looking for there, we can just say system.getEnv, and it'll return that environment variable if it's present. And if you're wondering what environment variables are present, you can return a full array of them just by saying system.getEnv, and it'll return a struct actually of all the environment variables that are there. Using this Java Lang system object makes it easy for your ColdFusion wrapper to grab any environment variables that it needs and use them. The way that I do this is when I init my wrappers, I hard code the environment variables that I'm looking for, and if they're present, I set them and can use them. So that's one way that you could incorporate them. The scaffolding tool that I have does this automatically. It sets this secret struct and it lists the environment variables that are going to be looking. It's going to be looking for. Now, as you may have been able to tell from that last slide, the next API that we're going to be working with is the Aylien text analysis API. This is one that I stumbled across on Todd Moto's list of APIs. They do natural language processing, a lot of neat stuff, much more real world than the Cat API. I certainly get frustrated when demos only deal with pictures and nothing that has any real world application. Analyzing text certainly does have real world applications, so I think it's more helpful to deal with in demo. So if we were going to get started writing a wrapper for them, the first thing that we would do is look at their documentation, we'd see the endpoint that the request needs to go to, and we'd see that they do API key authentication. There's two elements that they ask for, an application key and an application ID. Another note that we might see is that they say most of their endpoints support get and post, but if you're dealing with long documents, consider using post. So I saw that, and then I looked at their official clients, which are not ColdFusion, which are a variety of other languages, and all of their official clients only use post. So I took that as a tip. Why would I mess around with get when their official clients only use post? When I wrote a wrapper for this, my wrapper used post. It seems to be their preferred way of ingesting data. So by reading the docs and looking at other clients, I came to that conclusion. If we were going to scaffold it, it would look something like this. We don't have to scaffold it because this wrapper already exists in ForgeBox. You can mess around with it if you want to. When the wrapper gets in it, if it's just standard API key, it might look something like this. You know, we want an API key, it's going to Aylien, but we know here that they don't want an API key, they want an application ID and an application key. So I'll init it with those and I'll set those as constant variables that can be used in my wrapper. In the wrappers that I write, I like to have a method that returns the headers that I want present on every request to the API. So this get base HTTP headers method, it returns the headers that are going to be there on every single request to the API. So the content type, it's also where I include that authorization header, where those keys are passed in every request. So this would be something closer to basic auth, but we know that for Aylien, they want these two headers added. It's convenient to have a method that returns the headers used in every request so that you don't need to worry about them. They're included on every request, and by including the application key and application ID there, that takes care of authentication with Aylien. Just one more note about these headers, you'll see that there's a user agent header. The reason that I include that is that I found that there's actually an RFC spec for user agent. What it says is that the user agent should be included. User agents actually have a defined structure, which is application name, version, and then comments. And I went and I looked at some official API wrappers like Stripes and SendGrids, and they all include a user agent. So when I write wrappers, in order to follow the spec, follow best practices, I try to include that user agent header as well in my wrappers. You don't have to, doesn't have any practical difference, but I like to have it there. If we're working with Aylien, we're going to take this one endpoint that they have entity extraction, so it pulls out people, places, products, dates from a body of text. So we know it's going to be a post to the entities endpoint, which can be text, URL. Take a look at how this would actually work if we were writing it in a wrapper. This is the URL that we're going to analyze. It's just an Ars Technica article about Google, and we want to analyze it. That's what our code is going to look like. But let's take a quick look at the entities endpoint. So our entities endpoint is right here. You'll see that at the end, it's making a post request to /entities. And in the body of my function, I'm putting together the params that are going to be passed into it. Let's hop over here. We could do this for real if we wanted, but I think our time is running quick, so I'll just use the output that I have in the slide. If you make a request to Aylien's API to the entities endpoint, pass in a URL, this is what it returns. It can pull out the dates that it finds, organizations that it finds, all sorts of cool stuff. It extracts a body of text. It's a really helpful tool. But along with that helpful data, Aylien is an example where in the headers, they return information that's actually important to developers. So they return rate limiting headers, which if you're working with this API, that's helpful information to have. If you're a developer, you want to know that information. Just another reason why you don't want to just return data, but looking at those headers can actually be very helpful. Now, I quickly showed you that entities function, what it looked like. Here's it on a clearer screen. One of my first reactions when I see this is, shouldn't we validate this? Like, you know, there's a text and a URL argument, but what if neither come in? What if that language string that comes in isn't valid? What if the URL that comes in isn't valid? This data looks super messy and this seems like a problem. I feel like it should be validated. But when you're writing an API wrapper, my answer to shouldn't we validate is actually no. And the reason why is that you're reinventing the wheel. You're not reinventing the wheel, but you're doing work that doesn't need to be done. And the reason for that is that the API actually does validation itself. So if I made a call to the Aylien API and passed in an invalid URL, they send back a 400. And in the data response, they list the errors and they say that that parameter is not valid. And not every API is this elegant in the validation of the data that they do, but most APIs will handle data validation and pass back a helpful response. Your wrapper's job is to take what the developer does, send it along to the API, and then take what the API has and send it back to the developer. You don't need to validate the data. Leave that validation to the API. In most cases, that means less work for you and a better experience for developers. So just don't do work that you don't have to do. And I can say, just as a heads up, I'm going to go as fast as I can through the end of this, but we will probably go a little bit past 1 o'clock. I'm sure we're closing in on that. Just a note. I want to mention that your users are developers. So one of the nice things about that is you can make their lives easier. And often by making their lives easier, that means making your life easier if you're a person who's going to be using the wrapper. The way that you do this is by identifying pain points. I describe pain points as those things that happen while you're working with a wrapper, and they happen 2 or 3 times while you're working with an API. And you're like, oh, that was annoying, and oh, that was frustrating. How come I keep making that mistake? Those pain points, often when you're writing a wrapper, you can find ways to get around them. So in the case of the Aylien API, that entities endpoint takes a text or a URL. The problem is that one or the other is required, but you can't do both. If I want to pass in a URL, I have to name it. I have to say URL equals. I can't just pass that one. I can't just pass in a URL and not name the parameter. So one of the things that you could do, and I'm not saying this is the best way, but one approach you can do to make that easier is don't do text and URL arguments. Just have one single string argument. If it's a valid URL, then set the URL param. If it's not a valid URL, set text. And that way, when a developer is using this, they can pass in either text or a URL, and your wrapper takes care of it. Now, you might not like that because that kind of deviates from the structure of the endpoint. So there's another approach that you could do. You could leave your entities method with text and URL, but then there's nothing stopping you from freestyling and adding additional methods to your wrapper. So you could add an entities from URL and an entities from text method to specifically pass text or a URL down to that root method, making it clearer for developers what they're dealing with and making it so that they don't need to name the text and URL arguments that they're passing in because they're already named in the methods. For those, I'm not saying either one is better or that either is necessary, but identifying pain points and making adjustments to your wrapper to make your life and other developers' lives easier is one of the benefits of writing a ColdFusion wrapper, especially when it's not an official client library. All right, we're closing in on our last API here. This is the Lob API for Printables. Lob, this blew my mind, sends physical mail and postcards via API. So you can make API requests that result in actual mail ending up in people's mailboxes. When I read that, I don't know why, but it blew my mind. I think that's amazing. It certainly has real world applications. So it's just kind of up to your imagination what you could do with that. We want to start working with it. If we were going to scaffold it with the tool, it would look something like this. We have the endpoint. It takes basic auth, that's the docs. But again, this a starter point for this is already on ForgeBox. I kind of put it together for this presentation. If we read their docs, you'll see they say that they do basic authentication, but the way that they describe it is your API key is used as the username and you leave the password blank, which is a super strange way of doing basic auth, but you read the docs and you do what they say. They also said that they have a test and live endpoint, which is actually pretty common when you're dealing with APIs that interact with the real world. Stripe is another API that has that. So you're going to want to account for that in your wrapper, whether the request is going to be made to that test or that live endpoint. If you were going to create a wrapper for a simple API that had basic auth, you might structure the init like this, passing in a username and a password. But we know that Lobs isn't structured like this. We know that they only have an API key and they have one for their test environment and one for their live. So when I'm creating it, I would restructure my init and I would include my live API key and my test API key. And then I would add an additional Boolean option for whether test mode should be forced. And this enables you to develop against the test endpoint, and then when it's false, it would go to the live endpoint. When you're implementing this in the actual root CF-HTTP request, this is how basic auth would look with the username and password. But for Lobs, we're going to restructure it, and we're going to say, well, first of all, the password is blank because that's how they want it. And we're going to say if it's not in test mode, use the live API key for the username. Otherwise, use the test API key. And that's how I structure it so that that Boolean option will determine which API key is going to be used in the wrapper. Just a walkthrough. If we were posting to the test endpoint within our Lob account, we would see that postcards are created within their test environment. I don't think we really have time to do that demo, but that's how that works. Force test mode creates things in the test environment. An important note here, when you're looking through Lob's API, you'll see that they have, I think there's 12 parameters here in their address that are properties of their address object, which it isn't uncommon. It's just more than we've dealt with before. So you need to find a way to account for all of these possible parameters. In terms of parameters, if you look at SendGrid's API, if you look down here, their mail object has more than 68 properties. So there are these large objects that might need to be passed into a function, and dealing with that is something that you're going to encounter when you're writing API wrappers. One way to do this would be to list them all out, which would look something like this for that address object. But I think we can agree that that's not a very effective approach, listing them and then checking if they're present. It's not going to make writing API wrappers fun. So I'll give you two approaches. The fastest is to encapsulate all of them and just have one argument, a struct of the data. And that struct will, a developer will include the keys and values that are possible. So for the address object, that struct might have if we go back here, the description and the name and the address line 1. It wouldn't have address line 2. A developer using your wrapper would be required to make that struct and pass it in. And you don't have to deal with checking if each thing is present. You just take that struct and you pass it along to the API. This is a very fast way to deal with those complex parameters when there's a large number of parameters. It's frequently done by official API clients because it's a very efficient way of dealing with them. And there's certainly nothing wrong with it. I've done this a number of times. It's significantly preferable to listing out all of the possible arguments, but it does put a little bit of a burden on the developers using your wrapper to make sure that they structure that struct correctly. An approach that I think is preferable is to create a helper component. And you'll see this. I wrote a blog post about it if you want it in a little bit more depth. That's included here. But basically, it's another CFC, another component that can be used to build that JSON body that gets passed to the API. So we have this address object, we just pass that in, and that would create it. What is this? What do I mean by this? This is a bit abstract. For Lob's API, you can take a look at this because it's up on ForgeBox. I have a helpers/address.cfc component, and the properties of that component match up to the properties of the address resource in the Lob API. Within that component, I have functions for setting those properties. So it's pretty straightforward. If you call description, it sets the description. And then each function within that component returns this. That is, it returns the full object. And what this makes possible is chaining methods. So you can chain them one to the next. Now, another thing that this enables you to do is provide more succinct names for properties. So in Lob's API, the address, the city's property name is address_city, but no one likes typing underscores. So you can provide shorthand for this. You can just say, if someone sets city, I know that I need to set the address city property. Again, this may still seem abstract, but I think when you see what this looks like at the end, you'll understand why this is a more helpful, fluent, eloquent way of creating a complex object. You'd be able to do it something like this: Lob helper's address, and then here are these methods, description, company name, they're all chained together because they each return the full object. So description, company, and name. This address component then has all of these properties set, and I'm able to pass it in to my create address function, and that assembles the JSON for me. If you're interested at all in this, I'm blazing through it pretty quickly. I'd encourage you to look at that blog post I referenced on the earlier slide, or to reach out to me on the CFML Slack channel. I'm happy to answer questions about it, go into more depth, detail, review that address.cfc component. But it really is a very elegant method for dealing with complex resources in APIs. I don't think I quite did it justice in this session. Closing in on the home stretch here, just a final plea. Please document the wrappers that you write. Again, if not for other developers, for yourself, coming back to your own code and finding it documented is just much easier to deal with, especially if you're sharing it. I mean, because we all prefer well-documented code bases. It makes them much easier to dive into and to work with. So just a couple more notes on that. Docs shouldn't be an afterthought. One of the ways to make them easier to deal with is as you add methods to the API, add the documentation at the same time so that it's not overwhelming while you're working with the wrapper if you do it along the way. This link at the bottom, Rowan Manning's post here, has very helpful tips on how to write some helpful documentation. And these are just some other tips for things that you can do to make it easier to work with your API wrapper. Finally, if you're writing wrappers, just a plea to share them on ForgeBox, on Bitbucket, GitHub, GitLab, any way that you can get them back to the community. Because there's a lot of ColdFusion code that's been written out there, but if people keep it to themselves, then everyone ends up reinventing the wheel. So I encourage you, if you're writing wrappers, put them out there for the community to use. We all benefit when these wrappers get shared. That way we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And that is it for this session. I'm going to hop over to the chat now, and Charlie can grab it.
Yeah, well, thank you, sir. And what I'll do is
answer some of those questions.
Discussion mode. And you can see there's been a couple questions.
All right.
And everybody
Charlie,
else
did you grab that?
Right. Sorry,
Okay,
can you hear me speaking?
Open now.
Matt, can you hear me speaking?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry.
Okay, good. Before you say anything, let me just clarify. Everybody else, take a look on the right. There's an opportunity for you to offer your feedback on the session. Now, Matt, what was it you were trying to say?
I just was making sure that you took back the screen, that my screen wasn't still being shared.
Right. So if you go look at your Connect room now, the Connect screen, you'll see that it looks quite different than before. Oh, and there you go. You've piped in with your slide. Thank you for that. And you can speak your answers. We can still hear you.
Oh yes,
Right.
there's the slides.
And then you see there's a couple
Absolutely.
questions up above.
All right. So what do we have here?
And note one, the
Um,
first one about so you do a call
you
to a
call
CF
a
function.
CF.
That's from 8 minutes into the talk. So just give you perspective.
Yes. So do you call a CF? Yes. The way that the wrappers are structured is you call a CF function, and that function within the component, it makes the request to an external API and returns the data from that external API so that you can use it within your application. So within your code, you're calling a ColdFusion function, and that ColdFusion function is interacting with the external API. Question from Dave, is your API wrapper treated as a singleton in your application? Yes, in most cases. I think all of them, I treat it as a singleton. The helper objects, however, that I referenced at the very end quickly, those are transients. Slide decks are shared. And yeah, if anyone ever has any questions about these, about the wrappers, a lot of them are on ForgeBox. You can find me on Slack. I'm totally happy to help and answer any questions, anything that people want to know more about them. Like I said, I love APIs.
Okay. Well, if everybody feels their questions have been answered and doesn't have any other ones, it's a good time for us to stop the recording in case anybody's waiting to ask one off the recording. There's some typing going on. Okay, cool. All right, cool. And then I'll give it a little heads up that Matt and I are talking about having another of his summit talks on in the future. And perhaps still others, because you can see, by the way, Matt, if you didn't see over there on the right, said, would you like to see another session from the speaker? You got yes very much. So I look forward to
Sounds good.
that. All right, well then with that, let me go ahead and stop the recording. And again, if anybody's waiting to ask a question off